Now, some now we have our next presenter, Richard Wexler. I don't think many Minnesotans know what child protection does to Black and Brown kids, and the reason that Bage's amendment is so important is Minnesota. We have a history. I don't know, Richard. You will tell us. Is it number 3 or number 4 in the list of all the states of how Minnesotans take Black and Brown children?
Not
So
quite that bad. It's number 7.
number 7. Okay. Oh my God. It still is
Yes.
awful. And right now, Black and Native kids are not. The system is so big, and they need poor children to operate. So Somali children right now are at dangerous level. So Richard, he's a journalist. He's the executive director of Reforming Child Protection System. He's going to introduce to you. Richard, thank you so much for saying yes. Take it away.
Thank you very much. I'm going to make one more attempt here to see. Hello. The last time I spoke to a group in person was at a conference organized by Isuroon almost exactly 2 years ago. Last year, I spoke virtually. I'd hoped to be with you in person this year, but of course that's going to have to wait a little longer. But thank you very much for inviting me back again. And if you were here last year, this presentation is going to be largely a rerun. Things change very slowly in child welfare, but they do change. Now, in just the time I was first with you, the whole world learned a lesson about the abuses inflicted on people of color by police. Minneapolis, of course, was at the center of it all. I mention this because it's so important to understand that when Hennepin County and other Minnesota counties, what they call Child Protection Services, is also a police force. A better term for them would be the family police. In fact, they have even more power than the police. A police officer can throw your son up against the wall and frisk him. A Child Protection Services worker can come into your home, strip search your child, and walk out with him. That doesn't mean that's what they will do every time or even most of the time, but they can. Child helping agency that will provide the services you need to keep your family together. Sometimes that's true. Some caseworkers are wise enough and caring enough to do the right thing. They might see that there is no problem in your home, or they might see that there is a problem rooted in poverty, such as poor housing or no one to watch your children while you work, and they may help you get better housing or childcare. The problem is, you have no way of knowing what kind of caseworker will come to the door. What happens to your child will depend on who that caseworker is, what pressures are on her, how many other cases she has to deal with, and even whether or not the worker is under pressure, because a child abuse death is getting a lot of attention in the media. That's why it is so important to think of Child Protection Services as the family police. Now, what does everyone say to do when you face an investigation by the police? Call a lawyer. When confronted by the family police, the best thing to do is the same. Call a lawyer. Now, others can tell you who to call, when to make the call, and who else in addition to a lawyer you can call for support. I can only emphasize the importance of not going through this alone. And by the way, how great it is that Isuroon is moving into providing this service itself. Last year, I was told that sometimes parents are so ashamed of having their children taken away that they don't tell anyone. But you have nothing to be ashamed of. The people who should feel shame are the people who took away your children. The people who should feel shame are the people who built this system of family policing, the people who run it now and the people who refuse to change it. They have plenty of reason to be ashamed. The entire American child welfare system was built on a foundation not of benevolence, but of bigotry. In particular, fear and hatred of immigrants. It was largely the creation of this man, Charles Loring Brace, a Protestant minister in New York City who had seen the revolutions in Europe in 1848. He was terrified that, quote, the outcast, vicious, reckless multitude of New York boys might attempt a similar uprising. He hated and feared New York's immigrants, most of them Catholics, in much the way too many Americans fear Muslim immigrants today. He called Catholic immigrants the scum and refuse of ill-formed civilizations. Brace deemed the parents genetically inferior, but nevertheless felt the children could be saved, if only they could be taken from those parents and shipped off to farms in the South and Midwest. Excuse me. So between 1854 and 1929, more than 100,000 children were taken this way on so-called orphan trains. Some were orphans, many were not. Some were well treated in this first version of foster care, many were not. It was shameful then that a system permeated with racism is maintained today is more shameful still. Unfortunately, Minnesota is among the worst offenders. Minnesota takes away children at a rate double the national average and more than 2.5 times the rate of states that have been national leaders in using safe, proven programs to keep families together. As we talked about a moment ago, only 6 states take proportionately more children than Minnesota when the number of children taken is compared to the number of impoverished children in each state. And this is nothing new. Minnesota has been an extreme outlier for as long as anyone's been collecting data. In fact, the earliest state-by-state survey I know of goes back to 1985. Minnesota was an extreme outlier then too. Now, as you can see, there are some early signs of improvement. In 2018 and 2019, Minnesota took away fewer children than the year before. In 2020, the number of children taken actually went down as well, but the estimate for the number of children living in poverty went down more, probably because of the economic recovery bills passed in response to COVID. So that means because we compare entries to the number of children living in poverty, proportionately, Minnesota got a little worse, even as the rest of the country got ever so slightly better. But no matter how you measure, the bottom line is Minnesota still has an obscene rate of removal, a rate far worse than most of the country. So either Minnesota is a cesspool of depravity with vastly more child abuse than most of America, or Minnesota is taking away far too many children. The excuse for giving the family police such massive police power is the claim that it's necessary to stand up for children's rights. They tell us they're just erring on the side of the child. I doubt there is another phrase in the child welfare lexicon that has done more harm to children than err on the side of the child. When children are screaming in a detention center at the Mexican border or a foster home in Minnesota because they never needed to be taken away, don't know where their parents are, and don't know if they'll ever see them again, how is that erring on the side of the child? When massive studies tell us over and over again that in typical cases, children left in their own homes fare better even than comparably maltreated children placed in foster care, how is placing them in foster care erring on the side of the child? The harm occurs even when the foster home is a good one. The majority are. But there is far more abuse in foster care than in the general population, and far more than generally realized. The official numbers on this are garbage. That's because the official numbers involve agencies investigating themselves. That's why academic research consistently produces much higher rates of abuse in foster care. And bad as those outcomes are for family foster homes, the record of group homes and institutions is even worse. So if a child is taken from a safe home only to be beaten, raped, or killed in foster care, how is that erring on the side of the child? But even that isn't the worst of it. While workers are interrogating families over poverty, something else isn't getting done. A visit by a caseworker to check on a hotline call is delayed, or it doesn't happen at all. The extra phone call isn't made. A child in foster care is not seen. So a child in real danger is missed. The take the child and run approach makes all children less safe. It is those who perpetuate this approach who should be ashamed. Now, the overall rate of child removal in Minnesota is bad enough. It gets even worse when you examine the state's record for racial bias. In Minnesota, for example, Black and mixed-race children are in foster care at more than double the rate of white children. Now, the standard excuse from those in denial about racial bias is in itself revealing. For decades, foster care apologists insisted that they never took children because of poverty. But confront them about racial bias and they say, we don't take those children of color because of their race, it's because they're poor. The research makes clear that it's both. Most telling is what happens when caseworkers are given hypothetical situations and asked to evaluate the risk to the child. The scenarios are identical, except for the race of the family. The workers said the child was at greater risk when the family was so much as described as Black. There also are plenty of examples involving other families of color. Let's take a look at the chart again and add Native American children. A Native American child in Minnesota is 21 times more likely to be in foster care than a white child, the worst disparity in America. So congratulations, Minnesota. In other areas, you are merely among the worst in the nation when it comes to using child welfare as a cudgel against Native Americans. You're number one. Now, when we think of child abuse, we think of the horror stories, the children who are beaten, tortured, or murdered. These are among the worst imaginable horrors, even one such case is too many. Fortunately, they are also extremely rare. Investigations of child abuse begin when someone calls a child abuse hotline, but nationwide, out of every 100 calls to hotlines, 91 are so clearly false that they either are screened out by the hotline or found to be false by the family police themselves. Now, let's turn to the calls deemed by the family police to be true. And that requires no proof, just a worker checking a box on a form. 6 of those remaining 9 calls are deemed to be true cases of neglect. Now, sometimes neglect cases can be extremely serious. Deliberately locking a child in a closet and starving him is neglect. But so is running out of food because the SNAP benefits weren't enough to stretch for a month. Which do you think happens more often? The very definition of neglect in most state laws is a definition of poverty. In Minnesota, neglect is pretty much anything and everything. It includes failure by a person responsible for a child's care to supply the child with necessary food, clothing, shelter, health, medical, or other care required for the child's physical or mental health when reasonably able to do so. Failure to protect a child from conditions or actions that seriously endanger the child's physical or mental health when reasonably able to do so. Failure to provide necessary supervision or child care arrangements appropriate for a child. There is hardly an impoverished child in Minnesota who at some point has not been, quote, neglected, unquote, using these absurd definitions. So of course, Minnesota family police confuse poverty with neglect. It's inevitable. So that leaves 3 out of 100 calls. 3 out of 100 represent sexual abuse and all forms of physical abuse, from allegedly excessive corporal punishment to torture. So out of every 100 hotline calls, at most 3 fit the image that comes to mind when we hear the words child abuse. But decades of reading about horror stories, and sometimes deliberate efforts by some in the advocacy community to mislead us in the name of raising awareness, created a new danger. COVID-19 risked becoming the latest excuse to needlessly investigate families and take away children. For decades, we've been conditioned to believe the horror stories are typical, and all that stands between children and evil parents out to torture them supposedly is the equivalent of a thin blue line of professionals such as teachers and doctors who are required to report any suspicion of child abuse to the family police. Now add COVID-19 to the mix. What emerges is a false, racist narrative that goes like this. Now that fewer of these mostly white middle-class mandated reporters have their eyes constantly on overwhelmingly poor, disproportionately non-white children, it is claimed that their parents supposedly will unleash upon their children a, quote, pandemic of child abuse. Yes, the pandemic is putting more stress on everyone. But why do we rush to assume that poor people in general, and poor Black people and Native people in particular, for them, the only way they'll cope, supposedly, is to beat up their children? The myth has now been thoroughly debunked. A New York study found that when COVID forced the family police to step back, community-run mutual aid organizations stepped up. Far fewer families were traumatized by needless surveillance, and there was no compromise of safety. The Journal of the American Medical Association for Pediatrics declared flatly that, quote, child physical abuse did not increase during the pandemic. So how might we fix all this? Well, there are scores of recommendations at our website, nccpr.org. I'll highlight just 3. On racial bias, one good place to start would be to expand a practice pioneered in near New York City. It's called blind removal meetings. And I understand that at least one Minnesota county is going to try it or has begun to. Before workers can remove a child, they have to present the facts to a committee, but they must leave out information that gives away the race or the income of the family. That simple step appears to have led to a drop in removals of Black children. Now, there's been some dispute about this, but even a new critical look at the data suggests that this process reduces removals of children among all races. So I recommend trying it in a few counties, as Minnesota may be doing, to start with, to see how it works. Another vital step would be to turn child protection services into child poverty services. Now, that doesn't mean you have to wipe out poverty to eliminate child abuse and neglect, although that would be an excellent idea. But you can drastically reduce what agencies label neglect and the stresses that may lead to abuse by simply ameliorating the worst effects of poverty. Indeed, given the extent to which many in child welfare still deny that the problem is poverty, it's remarkable how often the solution is money. One study found that if you raise the minimum wage by $1 an hour, you cut the rate of what agencies call neglect by 10%. Another study found increasing the earned income tax credit by $1,000 per year cuts the likelihood of child protection services involvement by 7 to 10%. Another study found that increasing income by only $100 a year reduces the likelihood of a child maltreatment report by 2 percentage points. And all this should come as no surprise. A massive study found that when homeless families received housing vouchers, the rate at which they lost children to foster care was cut by half. But one part of the study was surprising. It also found that when the housing vouchers were accompanied by inflicting social work on the families, the results were not nearly as good. The families needed more cash and less social work. It also would be useful if Minnesota decision makers would finally swallow their collective pride and start looking at places that do child welfare better, which is in fact most places. Now, it's been 20 years since I first suggested that Minnesota look at the successful child welfare reforms in Alabama. Since then, journalists from newspapers ranging from the Springfield, Missouri News Leader to the Arizona Daily Star to the Tennessee Tribune to the New York Times did take a look. They found that thanks to a lawsuit consent decree, Alabama had indeed done an impressive job of reducing foster care, and independent court-appointed monitors found it was done with no compromise of child safety. But the most important single change any child welfare system can make is simply to level the playing field. In other words, provide high-quality family defense counsel for families. In New York City, for example, most families get a defense team, a lawyer with a reasonable caseload, a social worker, and sometimes a parent advocate, someone who's been through the system herself. And no, that is not to, quote, get bad parents off. It's so that the team can do what family policing agencies should do, but often don't. provide alternatives to cookie cutter service plans that rarely address families' real needs and can actually make things worse. A major study found that this approach reduces foster care with no compromise of safety. Even the city's Child Protection Services Agency supports it. And as for costs, it probably saves money by reducing foster care. And in many cases, the federal government now will pay half the costs. How can such change be achieved? By banding together with other groups that work with African American and Native American communities to change state laws and state policies. And after consulting with a lawyer to see if it's safe, by speaking up about what the family police have done to your children. In 2020, a revolution began when people of color spoke up about what the police do to them. That revolution began in Minneapolis. Another revolution can begin if families in Minnesota join together and join with families across the country to condemn what the family police are doing to their children. Thank you very much.
Okay.
And by the way, I want to apologize to Naomi Weiss, whoever you are. I have no idea how I wound up registered.
Richard, no, this is amazing. Thank you so much. You have nothing to apologize. You really did great, and you know your field. I am incredibly, like, I'm so happy since I met you 2 years ago. Child protection, you've taught us so much, but also now we can tell reading the Poverty Industry book by Daniel L. Hatcher, how the child protection system and a foster care, and actually some of the Department of Health and Human Services, actually how a poor child, removing a child from their families, is actually a cash flow for the system. Just listen. And when Professor Hatcher talks about this, he doesn't originally, like, this could be a veteran's kid, an orphan that is from white family. But profoundly, he showed how these kids are actually cash flow for the poverty industry. So again, this is where you've educated us. We're still continuing learning a lot. And I promise you, as right now, I was talking earlier today, Isuroon established a defense mechanism, and you've been connecting us to other states to learn from how do we protect our families. And what one question I really wanted to ask is, many of the families, when the child is taken away, so for example, say a Somali family that has 6 kids, the child protection comes in and they take one, but they also take the other 7. And usually families they're ashamed, mainly because today we're talking about female household led, or we call it matriarch household led, which is very targeted group. She's ashamed, she's shunned, and she's quiet about it. What can you tell us, community like us, to say, how do we support our mom? How do we support those families? And how do we tell people, do not wait until all the children are removed? You need to speak up. Any word that you can tell our families that are listening today?
Only, as I said during the presentation, you have nothing to be ashamed of. You should take pride in everything you have accomplished. Coming to a new country, a harsh climate in every sense of the term, building a life here. There's nothing for you to be ashamed of. The people who need to be ashamed are the people who took your children and the people who insist on justifying and maintaining a system that took your children. And so my hope is, as I think Isuroon has led the way, that the community rallies around these families and support. And as you support each other, I think you will see who has reason to be ashamed and who has every reason to stand tall.
Thank you so much. This is not the end. We started getting Molly as a team, and right now looking at the social worker. And also we have many, many parent advocates that are not behind the scene. So with your support and already the network you made it for us, I see a movement that's coming. And so thank you so much, Richard. We will be in touch for sure. I do appreciate your time.
Well, thank you. It was a great
Yeah.
pleasure.
See ya.